So I'm a film student, but I also work in photography, and that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today. Before I start, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Alex Moidy over there for making some of these slides. They were really last minute, but I think they're just quite excellent, as you will see. So, if I give you a horse and a gun, can you create a cowboy? Much of my work is centered around archetypes. When we think of archetypes, I find that we have no difficulty applying them to characters. If you look at tarot, you have fool, lovers, the innocent, and so on, which I find are a pretty good place to start. But what I always wondered was their application in other fields. So my art often deals with a process which I call world creation. In a sense, all of film involves some amount of world creation, only my work is a more obvious application of this process. So about 2 years ago, I began creating maps of fictional regions and countries and cities, such as these. When I created them, I thought they were just a fun hobby. However, after this pastime was met with a lot of confusion from my family and mostly thoughts of how could this be fun, I decided to ask myself the same question and figure out why I was so fixated on this irrational mapping of places that don't even exist. And I realized that this rotates around a single idea, an idea of control. So maps are tools that we use to understand and lay out our world. In a sense, he who has the tools to interpret and organize reality is already creating it. If you don't see it, look no further than the map of Africa, a continent divided up by ignorant colonialists who took no notice of ethnic makeup or of ancestral boundaries in order to divide up the territory to their own gain. Much of reality in Africa today is still defined by those few individuals who first interpreted it, and in the process, made their interpretation into reality. So, why am I seeking control? Is it because I wish to subjugate the inhabitants of a real territory to my power and my rule? No. My desire for control is much more personal. I want to make sense of the world around me and draw up maps which represent these perfect versions without complication. I'm working in the same process of some of those early colonialists, but by learning how archetypes operate, I'm instead working to dismantle them. So the work I started 2 years ago was mostly obvious world creation. In one series, I created 3 different postcards for 3 fictional cities, built out of parts of other cities. Quite literally, this project attempted to shed light on how our minds operate and our tendency to take knowledge of similar places and situations and apply them to new places. However, like a lot of my work, it was also an attempt to test viewer awareness and skepticism. Each postcard clearly represents the reality which only a few, possibly this fictional city's tourism board, want to give you. This grim-looking recession-hit landscape of the fictional city of Beaumont clearly jars with its presentation as an ideal Christmas destination. Much of modern media relies on the viewer to contemplate 2 forms with no inherent correlation and create a third form, meaning, by juxtaposing them. This was demonstrated in the famous Kuleshov experiment, where viewers were shown a bowl of soup and the face of a neutral man. They were then asked about the man's feelings. You might have guessed it, but it did not change, and they thought that his expression suggested hunger. Therefore, if I can make my viewer question the assembly suggested by a photo, maybe I can make them question how they independently assemble the pieces which define our daily reality. I have to say almost everything. So, I explored all of this in more depth in my next photography series, which was a Humans of New York style exploration of the citizens of Beaumont. Everything seems pretty straightforward until you take a look at some of the captions to the photos. It appears almost that each 2-page spread contradicts itself in the course of a sentence or two. I mean, they all make some sense at surface value. But when you start to think of how a Humans of New York caption is supposed to operate, my captions begin to fall apart in some subtle ways. So take a look at this piece, which depicts a smiling woman on one half of the page, and the same exact setup for the other half, only that she has a straight face. The caption reads both, I'm a proud mother to 6 wonderful children, and my husband was laid off yesterday. So, where's the contradiction? Essentially, this caption is attempting to provoke 2 emotional stimuli which contradict one another. It's demanding that you share this woman's sense of pride and joy, and simultaneously feel sympathy for her distress. You know, if this still doesn't feel fake, I can just let you know that I wrote all these stories, none of these characters exist, and the city of Beaumont is just a series of curated construction site photographs. The intention is as follows: to stimulate the process of world creation in the viewer's mind, but also cause them to question it, and apply meaning and emotion to neutral images with less haste. So eventually, like most artists, I began to think, how much can I get away with? And more specifically to most artists on a limited budget and schedule, I thought, how many corners can I cut? The point is, I don't have to feed you a full map of a city to have you believe it exists. I don't need to give you a postcard for you to think I've actually been there. I don't even need to show you the people who live there for you to think they inhabit a real space. I began to think on Kuleshov levels of sparsity. If I give you a horse and a gun, can you create a cowboy? And that's basically what I did. So, among the archetypal regions that I see discussed the most are the Middle East and the Midwestern United States, the latter being the location for my work based in Beaumont. The Middle East is discussed both as a ruinous hellhole with few inhabitants, and also as a hotbed of fundamentalist energy and nefarious activity. The Midwest, on the other hand, is often discussed as a heartland of brave warriors, which has faded into obscurity. But I began to wonder, are these archetypes true if they can be applied interchangeably? Each trio of images you see is constructed in such a way that it attempts to suggest a Middle Eastern or Midwestern scene, when in actuality it is composed of images from the opposite region. The phrase flyover country contains a double meaning when you think of the tendency of travelers to pass over the Midwest on a journey somewhere else, but also the increase of drones sent to Middle Eastern nations, both of them indicating a lack of concern for the region or its inhabitants. When I speak of foreign wares from distant lands, one might assume that I'm referring to the open-air markets of a country like Turkey, when I could easily be referring to an American Walmart or Costco. Therefore, the ease at which one can apply an archetype to an alternate region perhaps serves to say that these archetypes are inherently false. Of course, my work is heavily critical of the media, because the media is the easiest target when it comes to the topic of who is responsible for this mass, daily, and ultimately negative world creation. However, my work is not only critical of the media, but those who are critical of the media without changing anything. If you haven't realized it by now, there's no such thing as the media, per se, but there is an all-encompassing pool of consumers, all of whom are simultaneously selling something to someone. Just as much as the media may want to sell you an all-inclusive trip to a gentrified strip of coast you've never heard of, you may be trying to sell it to yourself, and ultimately, you're the one buying it. Even the blessed artist or journalist whose work seems cut out to expose bias is not immune to it. And yes, that includes me. So, recently my work has been focused on the bias of these authors, who we depend on to expose bias in archetypes. A series of mine from September featured a number of artistic photographs of dismal buildings, re-photographed in the setting of a rather fancy gallery. Oh wait, whoops. Oh, it's good. So in doing so, I attempted not only to critique this display of poverty for the sake of aesthetic value and decoration, but also my own complicity and bias as a documenter and observer. To reflect this theme of ever-growing levels of distortion between observation and final mentally formed reality, every level of this picture is fake. The photograph on display is not of a poor neighborhood, but the ugly parts of buildings in a very rich neighborhood. There's no gallery devoted to the work of this fictional artist, only a sliver of a private venue that I booked for this series. In short, there's no exhibition, only exhibitionism. We create archetypes because they're easy to believe and help us make sense of a chaotic world. A world in which we are presented with so many versions of the truth, it's hard to pick a consistent one to adhere to. However, choosing to believe archetypes is dangerous, as it literally creates these archetypes in reality. By subtly exposing the mechanics of world creation and the more dangerous archetype creation, I hope to make my viewers better critical thinkers and more cynical of the information they're presented with. We can't always control that information given to us, but we can check our thought process for flaws and assumptions and create a better reality as a result.